Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. So, kind of in keeping with the rest of our conversations the last couple weeks, right? The big news for everybody has obviously been that, you know, the NAR settlement came and we're all in a weird kind of place, feeling like what's going to happen, how are things going to change. We've talked about the changes in the compensation and all that stuff, and you know, probably what's going to be our next conversation is going to be more about practice, like what the conversations are we're going to have. But I was very interested to see in the changes that were coming in June to forms, we're addressing some of the questions that we had in discussions about what do we do when it comes to the compensation and things like that. So I wanted to talk about those forms. Besides that, there's a couple other changes that don't have anything to do with the compensation, with the lawsuit, with any of those things, but are important nonetheless. And so I want to discuss those too. So before we get into the NAR stuff, I'm going to address the couple of other changes that are coming in June that are important for you guys to understand, because it is a bit of a change and it's not something that we've had to do in the past. So any questions before I share my screen here and we get going? All right. So what you guys should be looking at right now is paragraph 3L of the revised purchase agreement that's going to be coming in June. So just so you guys can see, this is a draft of it. This is going to be June of this year, will be the new revised version. And one of the things they added to the RPA, which I thought was very interesting, is that insurability is a separate contingency now for the buyer. So it's not just like it used to be where insurance was part of the investigation and the inspections and that part of the buyer deciding on whether or not they were, you know, willing to move forward with the condition of the property. Insurability was one of those things. Now specifically insurance has its own contingency, which means that they're putting pressure because of how insurance is working for purchasers in the state of California now. How, you know, there is some difficulties in finding it, is they're just putting the pressure on making sure that people are doing it very early in the transaction, as opposed to our past MO, which was, oh, the lender will figure it out, right? We'll get it towards the end. So I like this, but it's its own specific contingency now, specifically in the RPA. That'll be coming in June, so you know, be prepared. So maybe as a preparation for what's coming in June that will be required of you, is maybe this is just something that becomes a business practice of yours, that you're making sure that people are putting a priority on their insurability, making sure that they can get insurance, what the insurance costs are going to be, because it does make a difference. You know, it makes a difference for people. If it's very expensive and you don't know until after maybe you've removed contingencies or gotten really far down the line of transaction, it could be a detriment to a buyer if the insurance is, you know, way out of line on cost. So earlier the better. So maybe as in preparation, like we were talking about with everything else, for what's to come for sure in June, is just make this a priority in your consultations and your conversations with your buyers, that insurance is a big deal. Okay. Questions about that before I move on? All right. Yes, Maricela, go ahead.
Kyle, so right there it says 17 days, you know, like a contingency.
Mm-hmm.
So if they remove it, you know, all contingencies, and then at day 25 they can't get insurance, or the insurance is a lot more than what they first thought, but they remove the contingency, they can lose the deposit. That can't be a reason, right? It works the same
No,
way.
no, that's you have 17 days to iron out your insurance issues. If you can't do it in 17 days, then don't remove the contingency, ask for an extension or cancel the agreement, right?
Okay. So
If you remove that insurance contingency and then turns out the insurance is different than what you thought it was prior, that's I'm sorry, but that's going to be the buyer's issue, not the seller's.
So, as a listing agent, you're gonna just want to counter that, make sure that they do it within 17 days. It sounds appropriate, right?
I mean, I don't. Here's the thing with most contingencies is I don't necessarily. I mean, I could see reducing some things like I say reducing appraisal contingency, especially when buyers are writing over appraised value, right? When a buyer's writing a crazy over appraised value, I say, okay, then I'm going to put some pressure on you to make sure the appraisal comes in early because I don't want to cancel later when we don't negotiate to the appraised value, right? When we can't get you to pay what you said you were going to pay. I think with something like insurance, with investigations, I don't see any reason with giving them 17 days unless there's some kind of super short escrow period. That's the thing that drives me nuts when I see like 21-day escrow periods and people leave everything in 17 days or, oh, we're going to close it in. I mean, I've seen, 17, 14-day escrows and they leave the contingencies of the days they are. That just doesn't make sense. The other thing is with contingencies, and I'm getting on a soapbox here, is we as the seller ask the buyer to reduce their contingency period, but we don't address our contingencies for delivering the documents. So, I mean, I'm okay with speeding things up, but not just to put pressure for pressure's sake. And that's, I think, what sometimes happens. So in something like the insurance, I would feel okay as a listing agent to say, you know what, I'm going to give you the full 17 days because I understand that it could be difficult to find insurance in California now. So let me give you time. I'm not accepting offers to cancel. I'm accepting offers to close. So, I mean, I don't see a need to shorten that unless the escrow is considerably shorter.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anybody else before I move on to the next one? Okay. So next, I mean, I'm sure some people have heard about this change, another law that is changing for us in July. And that change is in terms of disclosures. Right? So for those of you that don't know, in July, what will happen is a seller who has owned the property for less than 18 months, right? 18 months or less, and they're selling the property, as part of their disclosure, not only are they required to disclose what repairs or alterations they made to the property, but they also have to disclose the contractor information that did the work and the cost of that work that was done. That's only for people that have owned the property for 18 months or less. Now, people were making a big deal about, oh my gosh, you have to disclose all this stuff. You've had to disclose repairs and alterations already. The only change to this is that for people who are 18 months or less owners, which is, we know who that is, that's the investors, the flippers, they have to disclose the contractor that did the work, if the work was done with permits or without, and how much they spent to do the work. That's the only change, and it's only for investors. So they added a section here with these renovations and improvements. Okay? So first they changed some verbiage that says if yes, whether the property was built before 1978. If no, leave 1 and 2 blank. Okay? But if it was built prior to 1978, you're going to answer yes, 1 and 2. If yes, any renovations, the sanding, cutting, demolition of lead-based paint surfaces started or completed it. If it's no, then you don't have to go to 2. If it's yes, right, then you have to go to were the renovations done in compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency's lead-based paint renovation rule. That's the change to those, yes or no. The next section, this whole section is new that they added. Whether you purchase the property within 18 months of accepting an offer to sell it, yes or no. If yes, have any room additions, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs, collectively improvements, been performed by a contractor while you have owned the property? Yes or no. If yes, seller shall provide the explanation below, a list of such improvements and the name and contact information for each contractor who perform services of $500 or more. If yes to F1, Seller shall provide in the explanation below a list of those improvements for which seller has obtained permits, and seller shall attach copies of those permits to this SPQ. And for those improvements for which seller does not have a permit, seller shall include a statement identifying those improvements and that seller was not provided permits by a third party making the improvement, and the contact information for such third parties for whom the buyer may obtain those permits. Explanation or check, see attached, right? You're not going to have enough room for an explanation here, so you're going to have to attach something. Okay, so we got a couple questions in this. What if we did it ourselves, cheaper price? Look, if you did it yourself, I would still disclose all of the repairs that were done and that they were done by you. And if you did them without permits, also disclose what you did with or without permits. I wouldn't say, oh, well, a contractor didn't do it, I'm not gonna disclose it because it says contractor. They want to know, especially of 18 months or less, what you did and how you did it. So yeah, I don't know about cheaper price. I don't know what that means. If you did it yourself, you paid less to do the work probably, but you still have to disclose whether you did it properly or you did it with permits. Let's see. How do you feel this will affect flip investors in the resale, if at all? I mean, I don't know that it's going to affect them at all. I mean, maybe if, and again, this is just opinion, maybe if inventory were different, if inventory were a little bit different, maybe, you know, if there was a lot of homes for sale and buyers had a lot of choices, investors would probably have to, you know, do either better work or it might affect if they're not doing the work the right way. Today it doesn't matter. I mean it matters. Wait, let me rephrase that. It matters, but because there's such a lack of inventory, the buyers that are out there that can buy and are motivated to buy and are doing they're willing to look past some stuff. So I don't know that this is going to affect it a lot, other than what I think it will affect is your relationship with investors, because they're going to push back on some of this stuff and you guys are going to have to do the right thing, right? Like, you're going to have to be the one that's pressing for them to do the right thing and make sure they're disclosing everything properly. Maybe it's a good thing for investors, because maybe now they'll take, you know, the investors that don't choose to do super good quality work will be forced to do it, or they won't do flips anymore, so that the flips that are out there are done by people who are consistently doing quality work and are willing to stand behind the quality of that. I mean, that could be part of it that comes from that too. Okay, any other questions? I just wanted to show you that in the SPQ, because that change is coming in July for sure. That's going to happen. So you guys have to understand that you're going to have to do that with 18 months. Now, if it's just a normal property that you're selling that the people have lived in there for the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you should still be disclosing any repairs and modifications, all that stuff. You just don't have to go into all of who the contractor was, what the costs were, all of those things. Okay? All right. So let's move on now, I'm sure, to what you guys wanted to see. Let's start with the listing agreement. So the listing agreement is completely going to change, and it's going to look much more similar to the purchase agreement. As you guys know, the new purchase agreement changed to this grid format where everything is just kind of lined out, and then there's some explanation paragraphs that go into some details. So this is what the new listing agreement is going to look like. Again, it's not coming till June. That's a month away. There could be some revisions that are made, but I wanted you guys to know this, because in all the conversations we've had about the changing to how compensation is going to work, everybody has had questions about, well, what's going to happen in the listing agreement? What's the listing agreement going to look like? Well, here we're going to have an idea, probably 99% of what this is going to look like come July when the rules change, right? So date prepared hasn't changed. Exclusive right to sell, seller hasn't changed. The broker's name, that hasn't changed. All this stuff is the same, okay? So, the maximum listing period allowed by law for residential property with 1 to 4 units is 24 months from the date the agreement is made. This restriction does not apply if seller is a corporation, LLC, or a partnership. It is unlawful to record or file this listing agreement or memorandum or notice thereof with the county recorder. So, they're saying now, hey, look, there is a maximum amount of time that you can list a residential 1 to 4 unit property if it is not sold by a corporation, LLC, or partnership, right? If it's a regular people that live in their property, want to sell their house, 1 to 4 units, you could only list at a maximum of 24 months. I think that's crazy. I don't think most people are going to list things for 24 months. I think people list for a year, 6 months. That makes sense. But the max is 24. So anything outside of 24 is unenforceable. Okay. The items in this paragraph are contractual terms of the agreement. Referenced paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 7 pages. Seller is advised to read all 7 pages. Okay. So listing period. A1, beginning on date, ending at 11:59 p.m. on your end date. Remember, just like with our previous listing agreement, this new listing agreement, without a begin date or an end date, it is invalid. It is unenforceable. Okay? The list price, right? This is now everything's going to be in this grid format. List price, what you're listing it for. Property specifics, is it a manufactured or is it probate? Check off those boxes to include those addendums in there, right? Compensation to seller's broker, only seller's side of transaction. So it'll change how the compensation was before. Percent of the listing price, or if purchase agreement is entered, a percentage of the purchase price, and any other fees that you might be charging, or a flat rate. Okay? Now, optional additional compensation, if any, offered to buyers, brokers, and paid through seller's broker. So now there is an option if the seller's broker is going to pay something. So for example, if I say compensation up here to seller's broker is 6%, right? And then here, it's 3%. And here I'm going to say, hey, you're going to pay me an additional 3% if I check this box, so that I can pay it to the buyer's broker as compensation from me as the listing broker. Or the next choice is additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented. So that's saying if the buyer comes in and doesn't have representation, right? They show up at an open house or they call me on a sign call and we're going to pay compensation. Here's what I will pay you if they're unrepresented, right? So you're going to pay me 3% for representing U.S. seller. Potentially what you could say is I'm going to pay an additional 3% for you to offer to a buyer's broker. And I could also say I'm going to pay you 2% if there is a buyer that is unrepresented. Okay. Or if I'm the listing agent and saying by default, it says here that the total combined compensation is C1 and C2. This optional, right? That's what it is. If I represent both. If I have this, then it is C1 and C2. That's the optional that I'm going to pay. Okay. Total compensation to brokers unless otherwise agreed in writing. Seller shall pay broker the amount specified, if any, in C1 and C2 if buyer is represented, or the amount specified in C4 if the individual agent represents both seller and buyer, or the amount specified in C1 plus C3 if buyer is unrepresented. Okay, so it breaks down how that's going to get paid. This is the compensation to the broker, just like it used to be, where we would say like the exceptions where we had talked about in the past. Continuation of right to compensate broker. This is after the property has either expired or was canceled, right? We would put in there like we used to the 180 days. Seller obligation to pay previous brokers. It's there. And then the new thing that's is the optional seller's concessions. So this is in the MLS, the seller can offer concessions, right? We can't offer commission anymore. So as the new MLS changes, instead of offering compensation to a buyer's broker, there will be either in private remarks or a separate section that they're going to add where the seller where you can state seller will pay X amount for buyer concessions or seller concessions. So it says seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions and blank an amount of or the purchase price or a flat rate, right? So you can put it. So what they're saying here is they're from the very beginning saying, yes, I am willing to offer concessions to a buyer. Now, those concessions to a buyer can be used however the buyer wants to use them. They could be used to pay closing costs, or they could be used to pay the compensation to their buyer's agent. Okay, so you have choices. You could say as a seller, I don't want to pay any additional compensation to outside, but I will pay some concessions. So if a buyer needs to pay an agent, they can use that and pay their own closing costs, right? Or vice versa. They can pay their agent and pay their closing costs with the credit. Jesus, you put your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I got a little confused with C2, C3, and C4. So we're going to have 3% in C1.
Right, because that's what you're paying the broker. The C2 will be optional additional compensation, if any, offered to buyer's broker and paid through the seller's broker. So
2%.
Let's say that the buyer has,
2%.
let's say it's 3%. So that's if the buyer broker has a buyer representation agreement that they supply with their offer, right? And they put in there, and there's going to be a new CBC that says, hey, we're requesting for the listing agent to pay me. This is if the seller's broker is paying the commission, not they're going to pay. Basically what we're saying is, I'm going to pay you like C1 and 2. If we were to check those off, is like the listing agreement is today.
Correct.
Right. That's what that is.
Yes.
That's C1 and 2. C3 is if a buyer shows up that isn't represented. Right? They don't already have a buyer representation agreement. Right? They don't have that. So that would be, this is the compensation we're going to pay to a buyer that doesn't have any representation. Okay? Now, what this says right here is that if I have here that I'm going to pay 2% to a buyer's broker through my listing agent, and I'm also going to pay this for the unrepresented buyer, okay? You could see here that if I represent both buyer and seller, then I'm going to get the combination of 1 and 2. But if you look here, total compensation, unless otherwise agreed to, the total specified in any, if any, is C1 plus C2 if buyers represented, or the amount specified in C4 if the individual agent represents both buyer and seller, or the amount specified in C1 plus C3 if buyer is unrepresented.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think some of these things are going to change because I think that ultimately they become a little like redundant. So some of the stuff may change, but I think what it's doing is it's giving options, and the conversations that you guys are going to have with the sellers is it's going to give you options to how they can compensate, right? It's going to give you the option of saying, hey, listen, you could pay 3% to me knowing that I'm representing you only. Okay. And then if you want me to say in my website or in my marketing material, hey, I'm going to pay you, for me, listing broker, I'm going to pay you 2% to purchase the home. Then you could put in that optional additional compensation that's going to be offered to buyer's broker and paid through me. Like, I'm going to pay it. Okay. So, I mean, I think it's just giving you options to do that, or to say, hey, listen, here, this is how we're going to offer it. That's it. I don't know about the unrepresented, because I don't know how any buyer is going to buy something unrepresented. So I think that's probably going to change. And it's just going to go back to what the total compensation is. And for you guys to negotiate, you could always change this, right? Because it says here, if the same individual agent represents both buyer and seller, the total combined compensation shall be C1 and C2. So let's say you have 3 and 2 here for C1 and C2. And you don't want to pay that much. You could figure out what it would be for 4% of the sales price and put it here, the amount. You could put it there.
But once we use, we fill out C1, C2, then it could be D5 be left alone, correct?
See, this part? Oh, yeah, you don't have to do concessions and compensation. But those are two separate things. You could still say, hey, by the way, I still want to offer concessions to buyers because I want to attract the buyers. Like, I mean, if you think about what's happening today, right, for a seller today, forget about the changes to these rules. Today, are there sellers that are paying a listing agent, a buyer's agent, and still paying closing costs?
Yes.
Absolutely. So I don't think that that's going to change come July. And I think ultimately what it's doing for us, and I think this is the part that we're missing, is that it's, first of all, it's clarity for the consumer. It's clarity for the consumer. And what it's doing is it's forcing us to be clear on how compensation works. I think for a long time for us as agents, because either, and I'm not saying everybody, I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of agents out there that are, you guys, everybody, you're professionals. I get it. But I think there are some agents that don't have the confidence in their skill or the confidence in their value that they're providing to their clients, to potential sellers, to potential buyers. And so they fall back on these conversations when it comes to compensation and why we're here now is that I have to do this. I'm so sorry. You know what I mean? It's like I present it as, I don't even want to charge you money, but I'm required to. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of that in it when some of these agents don't have skills and they don't have a way to show value. Their fallback is I have to. I'm required to pay somebody else. And that hasn't been true for a long time. But if we're able to explain to them how compensation is used, the value of compensation, the value of concessions, the value we provide to them, then we get less and less of that pushback and less chances that we're going to find ourselves in a position where now compensation has changed for us. And who knows if next on the horizon is dual agency, where you start eliminating the idea that you represent both buyer and seller. And it's because of the same thing. It's because there is no clarity in those parts of our business that we put ourselves in the position that we're in. And I'm hoping that maybe for all of us to change, how we do our business, how we handle our conversations with sellers, potential sellers, with buyers, potential buyers, that we don't find ourselves in a position where we have to now reevaluate our entire business model and then change how we do business and have these kind of fears of big changes. Anyway, that was a soapbox for me. I apologize. So it's very broken down now on how compensation is going to work. Again, items included. I like that they went to this form of the chart, like this breakdown, instead of everything being a paragraph. So everything is broken down in this grid format. Like it. It's much cleaner. It's going to be a lot easier for you guys to explain and to go through. They added in here now, for the SPRP, all the stuff is in there. I like it's in the grid. And then these paragraphs are the explanation, the detail of the stuff that you filled out. Okay. So this is what's going to look like. The new listing agreement is going to look like when we get to July, or very, very similar. And some things are going to adjust. Probably there may be some changes in the verbiage, but that's pretty much what it's going to look like for a listing agreement. Okay. Let's see. Next up, let's see. What do we want to talk about? So a lot of people have been asking also, well, what if I take a listing in June and then everything changes in July? Well, here is the form for that. Disclosure and modification to listing agreement intended for use with an RLA revised 1223 or earlier, right? So anything that is not the new listing agreement that'll come in June, this is that disclosure to modify that listing that existed prior to the changes in how compensation was disclosed or offered or any of those things. So here's, you put your information, the broker, the seller, entered into the listing agreement, the date the listing agreement was written, the property, the start date, and the expiration date of the original listing. So if I signed a listing today that's going to go for the next 6 months, come June, I'm going to do this disclosure and modification to the listing agreement. So number one is the disclosure. Offering compensation to brokers representing buyers through the multiple listing service. You, seller, authorized me as your broker to use the MLS to offer compensation to brokers who represent buyers who purchase your property. The amount paid to the broker representing the buyer will come from the total compensation that you, seller, agreed to pay my brokerage. The National Association of Realtors has entered into a nationwide settlement agreement to resolve a class action lawsuit. One of the terms of the settlement is that the multiple listing service will no longer be used for listing brokers to make offers of compensation to brokers representing buyers. The MLS may still be used to expose your property to the maximum number of prospective buyers. The settlement is expected to take effect sometime in July, but sub-local MLSs may implement the prohibition sooner. Until the MLS in which your property is marketed for sale makes a change, the offer of compensation will remain in the MLS. Once the MLS changes its rules to prohibit offers of compensation, your brokerage may offer compensation to buyer brokers through other methods of communication. Need to modify the listing agreement. Seller and broker agree it is mutually beneficial to modify the listing agreement to allow your property to be exposed to as many buyers as possible once the MLS changes to reflect the NAR settlement. The modification of the listing agreement. Broker agrees to notify seller once the MLS will no longer be able to be used to offer compensation to buyers brokers. Broker also agrees to notify seller of the method and means it will use to offer compensation to buyers brokers when that event occurs. Broker agrees to use reasonable efforts consistent with the NAR settlement to continue to market seller's property and offer compensation to buyers brokers to the maximum extent reasonably practicable. Seller agrees that the listing agreement term authorizing broker to cooperate with the compensate brokers participating through the MLS will no longer be in effect as of the date of MLS prohibits such offers of compensation. Seller also agrees that brokers' reasonable efforts in place of the MLS offer of compensation will satisfy brokers' obligations under the listing agreement. All other terms remain the same. So basically what it's saying is, after we read the whole thing, basically what it's saying is, hey, I'm letting you know that we signed a listing agreement where you wanted me to offer compensation. At some point in July, that offer of compensation in the MLS is going to disappear. We have to modify your listing agreement, so I'm going to let you know the date that it changes, the date that the MLS is no longer offering compensation, and how I am going to be offering the compensation to cooperating brokers. Because you're paying me through our total compensation an amount of whatever it is, 4, 5, 6%. And of that 4, 5, 6%, we agreed that I would be offering out 2 or 3% to a buyer broker for them being the cooperating broker. So that's all it is just kind of like a rundown of like, hey, the rules changed based on the listing agreement we have, but the listing agreement we have is still enforceable. Okay, so people had asked what was that going to mean if I took a listing prior. So I think they've addressed it here in that modification. And they also have a modification of any buyer representation agreements. And I thought I had that one. I guess I don't. They do have the same thing. It looks just like this, disclosure and modification, but it's a disclosure and modification of the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Okay. Let's go on to this, the new buyer representation. Let me get over here. Any questions? Any questions? Raise your hand, type it in the chat. Any questions at all? Because again, these things are coming in June. I just want you guys to be prepared. Maybe put you at ease a little bit that, you know, stuff's going to be in existence that's going to help you to be able to perform your duties as an agent. Anybody? No questions? All right. Buyer representation agreement, again, also changed to that grid format, just like the listing agreement is going to change to, and the buyers and the RPA has changed to. So it changes to that grid format. Just so it's clearer, right? Representation period. beginning on and ending on. Okay. The old buyer representation had a beginning on and how many days it was good for. Now this is more like a listing agreement where it's beginning on and ending on. That's it. Or the completion of a transaction, whichever occurs first. Right at the beginning, if you guys remember, we went over the buyer representation agreement, 3 weeks ago, and it was kind of buried whether this was a non-exclusive or an exclusive. They brought it right to the top. Right? Is this a non-exclusive representation or is this an exclusive? If exclusive is checked, broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period or with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing buyers. So remember, if it's non-exclusive, if you leave it as the default non-exclusive, if you want to be compensated by your buyer for the compensation for representing them, you have to introduce them to the property. So it doesn't matter what criteria you put in, what cities, what the all those things. If you don't introduce them to the property, meaning you don't show them the property, take them there physically and show them, or do some kind of a virtual showing, you don't get compensated even if they buy a property that fits the criteria that you've added into this contract. So non-exclusive, remember that. So you want to do exclusive, okay? Property to be acquired. They've taken out pricing. They've taken out the idea of like, here's our price range. Remember we talked about that a few weeks ago, about price ranges, about how we couldn't be, they just took that out altogether. Now by default, this is the property that's going to be acquired is a single family residential, which includes condominiums and manufactured homes. If it's going to be units or anything like that, you can check off these boxes and change what it is, the type of property that they're looking for. The location, the counties and the cities that you're looking to work in, perfect. Any kind of additional descriptions, that's fine. Or if it's only for specified properties, let's say, for example, that it's just for, hey, I want to show, these two properties that showed up. That's all they're willing to sign the agreement for, or a list of properties that you want to show them. And that's all they're willing to sign an agreement for, are those specific properties. You could do it that way also. Properties excluded from representation. Let's say, for example, that a buyer had previously signed this with a list of properties that they were going to be represented by that agent. You would have to attach that list to this representation, knowing that if I show them that and they write an offer, I will not be representing them to them. There is a new form called the additional buyer preferences and priorities. And that is this one right. Is this it? Yeah, here it is. This. So in addition to, and I think, again, these kind of things are going to help us to be better in consultations with buyers, this is for them to start giving you an idea of what's important to them, right? So the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. So we could look at a price range that they want to use. Is this going to be my primary residence or my second home? Income producing? Is it for investment? Okay. What kind of property do I want? A single family, a duplex, triplex, fourplex, a condominium that's apartment style, or a condominium that's townhouse style? Is it a tenants in common building? Is it a manufactured home in a park or on its own land? Is this pre-owned, which is the majority of what we sell, or is it new construction, what I'm interested in? A minimum number of bedrooms that I'm willing to look at, a minimum number of bathrooms that I want, the minimum square footage or a maximum square footage. Do I want single story, multi-level, corner lot? Do I want yard with grass or drought? It's going to give us kind of a script to follow to make sure we know what our buyers want. I think sometimes for us as buyers agents, we still stay very surface with our buyers. We don't get into specifics of what they want. We really only talk about what school district do you want, what city do you want, how many bedrooms, how many baths, and that's about it. But I think what's going to happen is it's going to get us into the conversation of like, okay, what's the minimum amount of square footage that you want in your property? Or what's the minimum number of bedrooms that you could work with? Now, I know you want 3, but could minimum be 2? Could you live with 2? Or I know you want 4, would 3 be okay? right? Okay, yeah, well, a bare minimum is 3. Okay, now I can check off that box. And I can put in 3. I got to have a minimum of 2 bathrooms. Okay, terrific. Minimum 2 bathrooms. And what it's going to do is it's giving me a roadmap of the type of properties that I want to try to identify for my buyer. Because this is a conversation that we don't always have with buyers. A lot of times we get a buyer and it's the first thing is straight to the lender. Can they qualify? Great. And then we're in our cars and we're showing them property. And you know, having conversations with agents a lot, we find out like agents are like, we wrote an offer, and then they go home and they're like, we changed our mind. And we've done that 3 or 4 or 5 times. And, you know, sometimes it's the buyer's fault and sometimes it's our fault. You know, sometimes buyers are just finicky and picky and they don't really know what they want and they don't know how to verbalize it. And sometimes as agents, we don't ask the right questions, so we don't know what they want. We think they do. And we make assumptions based on what we would want in their place, right? If I qualified for this amount and I qualified to live in this city, this is the kind of house I would want. And we don't put enough into the conversations about specifically what they want. So now, with the buyer representation agreement, since we're all going to have it, this form, we can attach that buyer representation agreement and make it a little bit more specific about what it is they want. Okay? Let me switch back to the buyer representation agreement. Questions so far on the buyer representation and on that BIPP, which is the identifying the preferences. Anybody? Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Jesus.
I think it's great. It's almost like a buyer's presentation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's ultimately what it does is it's giving us more ammunition to sit down and have the right conversations with our buyers, because, I mean, we're going to have to start drafting buyer presentations like we do listing presentations, right? Right. I mean, that's just it is. And so if you guys aren't already starting to work on, and I know as a company and as probably other brokers and other people out there, we also have to find out like how we can support you and what that value is for buyer presentations, and we'll do that. But each individual agent that's out there, the people watching this video later, the ones that are on the class now, this is the next 66 days or whatever it is. You have an opportunity to really look at your business, evaluate your business, make sure that I have the ability to share with a buyer what my value is to them. And now with the documents that are going to be coming in June, which, I mean, I know it's a month prior to what's going to happen, they're going to be here in June, and you guys could go to CAR and go to standard forms and get these drafts just like I did. All of you guys have access to it. You could get it and you could look through them and you could make notes and you could read them and you could do those things. Okay. But having something like the BIPP, that identification of preferences and priorities, I think is going to help make your job easier. Now, that's just me putting that as a new tool in my arsenal to be able to have conversations with buyers. Okay. Now, let's go here to the next part, broker compensation. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. See attached broker compensation advisory form, BCA, and there's another form that's coming with this. And that is this one. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but really it's just a breakdown of how the compensation works. Okay. So again, one more form to help us kind of explain the compensation process. So here is the amount of compensation that the buyer is going to pay their buyer's agent. This is what they're agreeing to. Okay. Now remember, whatever this amount is the maximum amount that the buyer's agent can receive. Okay. Payments from third parties shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 3D1. But they did add this. Unless that amount is modified in a subsequent writing between broker and buyer at the time the overage amount is known. If broker has a listing agreement with seller, see paragraph 4F. We'll get to that. So, I remember when we first started talking about this, that people would say, well, can we amend this? Can we do that? And it looks like the answer is going to be yes. If I am representing a buyer, right? So I have a buyer representation agreement that says my buyer is going to pay me 1.5 points. Okay. And I talk to Jacob, and Jacob says, hey, look, man, I really want to work with you, and I've already talked to my seller because we know that you're a good agent and we can get this done. My seller is going to pay you 2.5% compensation. Okay, we're going to pay it. I'll pay it through our broker, but it's going to be 2.5%. I can then go back to my buyer and say, buyer, because I know I'm getting paid 2.5% from the seller, we're going to modify our buyer representation agreement because I just found out that I can get paid more. That's it. We can. So I know that was a concern for a lot of agents when we first originally talked about this. Well, if they're offering 3, can I change it? And I said back then, I don't know. I don't know if we're going to have the ability to amend it based on finding out that the compensation that's going to be paid by a third party is higher. And now, according to CAR, and who knows if this changes between now and July, but according to CAR at the moment, on a form that they're going to release in June, yes, you can. You can modify your buyer representation agreement and change the compensation amount at the time you find out that there is additional compensation being paid. Okay, so good news for you guys. The continuation of right to compensation for broker involved in the properties, that's just like the listing agreement. So we'd put, 180 calendar days, 90 calendar days, whatever it is you negotiate as part of your consultation. Cancellation notice. If it's non-exclusive, either party can cancel immediately, okay? Or we could put 30 days after, 15 days, whatever. If it's exclusive, if it's an exclusive agreement, it is canceled 30 days after the notification of cancellation by either party, okay? So unlike a listing agreement, the buyer can cancel this agreement. You can cancel this agreement, right? So if, for example, it's not working out and the buyer says, yeah, I don't want to work with you anymore, they give you a notice on an exclusive buyer representation agreement, you still represent them for the next 30 days. Anything that you introduce to them, if they buy it for the next 30 days before it cancels, then they owe you compensation. And if it does cancel, then this part here, that 180 days or 90 days or whatever it is that you put into the spot, if they go and buy a property that you introduced to them, right, then they would owe you compensation. Okay? Questions? Let's see. Is the modification added with the purchase agreement for increased commission? No, for the purchase agreement, you're going to use this form, which is the SPBB, right? So this is the new SPBB. It just talks about the amount of compensation and who's paying it. So when you're sending in your offer, you would send this SPBB with your offer requesting the compensation. Okay. If you're modifying it, you just send this original buyer representation agreement and the modification together to escrow showing the compensation. Okay, let's see what we got here. What if your buyer goes to an open house without your knowledge and then they like it and want to write an offer? Can the listing agent take credit and not pay the buyer's agent? Or if you have a commission agreement with your buyer, can the buyer not be enforced? Okay, so there's three other forms that I wasn't going to show you guys today. I'm not going to show you because in reading about them, two of them kind of do the exact same thing, and one of them is just kind of a disclosure for open houses specifically. So until I know for sure that CAR is going to use this, because they said we've created these in case this is how open houses get handled. So CAR is working on stuff for open houses. There's one form that's called an open house visitor non-agency. So you would have everybody that comes into your open house would sign that saying, hey, either I have an agent representing me or I don't want you to represent me, but I want to see the property. So they would sign that. or there is a limited representation that is specific to the open house property that says if a buyer shows up and does not have a buyer representation agreement with their broker, that they want you to, for the next 30 days, represent them in order to purchase that home from the open house. They're not sure that those are going to be the final form, so I didn't want to get into it, but they are addressing open houses. So if, for example, in the question that Lucely asked in the chat, if you have a buyer that's going to an open house and you have a buyer representation agreement that's exclusive, right? This is what we're trying to go for, the exclusive buyer representation agreements. If I have an exclusive buyer representation agreement, then what would happen is my buyer would go to that open house, either the form that exists now or whatever the final form is that comes out in July. The buyer's the listing agent that's at the, or the agent that's at the open house would have to have your buyer sign something that says, I don't have agency with you, and I also have a buyer representation agreement already with another agent. That way, the buyer would disclose to them that I'm already, paying somebody to represent me, and you wouldn't have that where the agent takes them. They wouldn't be able to, because then the buyer could be liable for 2 commissions if they were to do that. I can email you guys the forms, but you can also get them from CAR. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just put the link in the chat for you guys so you can get to that. Any other questions? Oh, that's not where I wanted to go. Any other questions? Okay. Another form that comes along with this is the buyer's financial and personal information, or personal info. Within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, we're going to disclose all of the buyer's financial information, just like you would with, an offer or anything like that. Because, again, you may sign one of these agreements with somebody prior to having all this information. So there is this form, which is, and we won't, again, not going to dig into all this. It is a breakdown of their personal and financial information. How much money they have for a deposit, how much money they have available for down payment, where the source is, what the maximum loan amount is, their lender information, what kind of financing they're doing, their other financial information, personal information about where their current housing, their experience, if they're related, right? Like that kind of stuff. So that's a secondary form that's going to go there. And guess what? If they don't do that and within the 5 calendar days, you can cancel your agreement. You don't work with them, right? Or if the buyer cannot afford to pay your compensation, you're not forced to work with them. Okay? Let me see. I'm trying to get here to you guys to get the link. Just a second, Jesus. Jesus, while I'm doing that, go ahead and ask your question.
So the last form that you show, that is more for the selling agent and the buyer, just to make sure he has money to pay us.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's for you and the buyers. It's for you and the buyer, the buyer's agent and the buyer. That's what it's for. It's for us to show me that you have the ability to pay me. All right, so let me see. In chat, I'm going to paste the link right here, and it has all of the forms, because there's way more than what I'm showing you. There's a ton of them. So if you guys want to look at all of the changes, you can, but I just sent that link in the chat so that you guys can look at it. Okay. Then it goes and breaks down what each one of those things are, like, the compensation, how it works, and what it means to be exclusive and non-exclusive, and what buyer acquisition means, and how the compensation are involved with all the properties. It's in there. Now, I remember one of the other questions. Do you guys have any other questions? I'm not going to go through the rest of this form because we're almost done, but did you guys have any other questions about this one before I move on? Yeah, go ahead, Darwin. Hello, Darwin, you there? Well, he was unmuted. Let's try it one more time. You there, Darwin? All right. Well, maybe just type your chat or question in the chat if you can. I'm gonna not share my screen so I can just talk to you guys here for a moment. Okay. So I also remember early on when we first started talking about the changes that were going to come as far as compensation goes, that some people were asking, well, what if the buyer wants a property and the seller won't pay their compensation? So, for example, I'm representing Marisela as my buyer, right? And she's agreed to pay me 2%. And as part of my offer, I'm requesting the seller, right? I use the SPBB. I send that in with my offer, and I request that the seller pay her obligation to compensate me. And the seller says no. And the buyer does not have the ability to pay it. And that's why we're asking for it. At that point, I can step out as agent. I don't have to represent her. I could say, if you want to buy this property, then you're on your own. You have to negotiate purchasing it on your own, or some other way to make this transaction happen. I am not required then to represent her if she cannot pay me, or if a third party is not paying me. So I know somebody had asked that. I don't know exactly what the mechanics of that will be, but in the documents that we've gone through and some of the things that CAR is proposing that's going to be coming in June, it does say if the seller will, or if a third party does not pay compensation and the buyer is unable to compensate, that the buyer's broker is no longer required to represent them in the transaction. So know that, because I know somebody had asked me that. I don't remember who it was. It's been a few weeks we've talked about these things, but somebody did ask me that earlier in our conversations. Okay, before we go, any questions about anything? Somebody that feels like a for sale by owner. Yeah, sure, could be. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's in there, and we'll probably talk about some more of them next week, because there are things that don't apply to that, to the NAR settlement. There's some changes that are going to be in there, things like compensation agreement, how that's changed, and things like that. So we may talk about those next week. I'm not sure, but yeah, pretty much it's going to be a buyer, instead of a for sale by owner. I don't know what we'll call those. Bring your own buyer. I don't know. Jesus, go ahead.
I received a buyer's compensation yesterday from one of my listings, and it was very vague. It only had 200 days, no commission or nothing. Would that be applicable? I mean, he just filled it out. He just put the name.
Right now it doesn't really matter. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think what I mean. Right now it doesn't matter. I mean, right. You're paying, if you receive the offer, I'm assuming you're paying compensation.
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter, because you're paying compensation through the MLS. But for you guys, I mean, the thing is if we're going to start putting this to practice, put it into practice properly, right? It's like talking about sports, right? You practice how you play. So if you're going to start using these forms now to get prepared for what's going to happen in July, just make sure you're doing it right. And having a form that's not completely filled out is not going to help you get better. Let's see, what is for the 18-month flip timeline? When will that take? That's July also. I think it's July 1st. That one. I think they have a date already. I think that one's July 1st. All right. Anything else, guys? Again, change is inevitable. It's always going to happen to us. I think, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people. Commercial agents have been doing business like this for a really long time. This is how commercial agents do it. There is no guarantee for compensation in any commercial transaction. I mean, yes, there are commercial transactions that happen through the MLS, right, for people who aren't commercial agents, but for solely commercial agents that do their business through LoopNet and CoStar and use the AIR forms instead of the CAR forms, those kind of commercial agents have never had a guarantee of compensation, and every offer they write is the compensation for that buyer's broker is negotiated into that offer. So for a commercial agent, hearing all this news that residential agents are freaking out and the NAR has ruined us and all of those things, they're already prepared for it. So if you want to look to something as an example of what our business is going to look like, look to commercial real estate. because it's going to be a lot like that. I think that all of our stuff now is just going to be negotiated. Like, hey, here's my pricing. This is what we're willing to write an offer. I mean, I helped an agent that I talked to an agent the other day that said, hey, I have a buyer that wants to buy this, what is it, a $3 million building or whatever. How do I get compensation? And I said, you pick up the phone, you call them. It's commercial. So you pick up the phone, you call them and say, hey, what's the compensation? What do I need to write? How do I write the offer to get the compensation paid? And then you write the offer that way. Now, that commercial agent wanted air forms, and the agent that I was talking to didn't have access to air forms. So she says, what do I do? I said, well, you call the agent and tell him, okay, I don't have access to air forms. Do you want me to submit it on a CAR form and then you'll redo it? What do you want me to do? And it turned out they said, send me a LOI, write a letter of intent, and we'll draft it from that. So again, it's just going to go back to the ideas. Like, we have to get into the habit of having conversations with agents. And if you guys are a listing agent, don't blow off the buyer's agents. Start getting into the habit of answering the phone calls and having conversations with them and discussing with them do some negotiating prior to have them writing the offer. We've always practiced in residential real estate that I'm not going to tell you anything. You send me your best offer and you guess at what I want, and then we'll go from there. But now we're going to be more into that commercial thing where we're going to have conversations where, as buyer's agent, I'm going to have to pick up the phone, call the listing agent and say, listen, I got this great buyer. They got, 780 FICO score. They've got, 25% down payment. They've already gotten a DU approval. They're ready to go. Is there any compensation is there any room for compensation? And how do we have to write that offer to get my compensation paid? And that's it. That's the conversation. And so if we as listing agents today start getting in the habit of having those conversations with buyer's agents, now, like negotiating with them and telling them, hey, look, if you want to get this offer accepted, this is what you need to write. This is where we need to get it to go. I mean, start having those conversations now. And if you're a buyer's agent, start having those conversations, calling listing agents. Hey, tell me, I want this property. What do I need to do to write the offer to even get a counter offer or to get accepted? What do you want? Tell me what you want. Maybe now, because I know listing agents in the past have been like, write your best offer. Maybe now they're going to be a little bit less likely to make that answer. So it's, again, just prepping ourselves what's coming, not just being punched in the gut and surprised. So, all right, any other questions before I let you guys go? I know we went a little bit over. Thank you guys so much for being here. If you missed any part of this, you want to revisit it, it'll be on YouTube probably later today. I really, really appreciate you guys being here. So take care of yourselves. Be productive.